SeaWorld is coming off perhaps the most tumultuous decade any theme park operator has ever faced in history. They've been put on trial, they've been canceled, they've been shut down, and they've completely changed how their parks operate. This while having a revolving door of CEOs who walk into the building for a couple months, look at what they have laid out in front of them and say, yeah, I'm not dealing with that mess. This all leading up to today, as the SeaWorld brand name seems to be headed out for its last dance. And you would be forgiven for thinking that the path to this end was a straightforward line, but let me tell you folks, it was anything but that. The story of SeaWorld has been an absolute roller coaster ride of extreme highs and extreme lows. So strap in folks, because there's a lot that lies under the surface when it comes to SeaWorld. And the thing that really kicked off this series of unfortunate events for SeaWorld was the death of one of their trainers in early 2010 at the hands of a killer whale. Shortly after this incident, SeaWorld was fined tens of thousands of dollars by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, but this was just a slap on the wrist, as eventually OSHA would come back 2 years later, suing SeaWorld in an attempt to end the practice altogether of trainers getting in the water with killer whales, so a tragedy like what happened in 2010 doesn't have to happen ever again. Though SeaWorld fought tooth and nail to keep the practice alive, ultimately they were unsuccessful, and their orca and killer whale shows had to change forever, with trainers only being able to interact with the killer whales when they are out of the water on these ledges. But little did SeaWorld know this was just the beginning of their troubles, because the way they handled the death of their trainer in 2010 and the ongoing court case is what resulted in the creation of a documentary that you might be familiar with called Blackfish. This hit piece came out while the court case was still ongoing, so much of it focuses on the dangers associated with trainers getting in the water with killer whales. However, the part of the documentary that would end up having the longest lasting impact was the discussion about the living conditions for killer whales in captivity at SeaWorld. The documentary would highlight a number of cases of mistreatment and negligence, which, combined with several instances of SeaWorld lying to the public on a consistent basis about both of these subjects, and resulted in SeaWorld being pinned as an abuser of animals. And that was that. SeaWorld became a villain overnight. And then the cherry on top of all of this is the fact that it is a CNN film, meaning that it would play quite often on the network, resulting in tens of millions of people seeing it. Congratulations, SeaWorld, you found yourself in the mother of all messes. But it wasn't just the documentary itself, as well as the word of mouth that would spread from it, that pushed this narrative along. It was something else. SeaWorld, shortly after the movie came out, put out a response, and they called the movie misleading and inaccurate. Plain out. And though, sure, there are some points in the movie you could point to and say, yeah, no, that wasn't right, or that was presented in an unfair way, but the bottom line is calling the whole movie inaccurate is insane to say, because it's just obviously not true, and it falls right in line with the way that SeaWorld was presented in the movie as being a continual liar. And to be honest, SeaWorld probably would have been better off just not saying anything. And yeah, ignoring the issue would have been a bad way to go as well, but it certainly would have been better than saying something so antagonistically stupid that only just further fanned the flames of hatred towards you. But here's the thing. SeaWorld is not just their killer whales. They're not just their killer whale shows. They can still survive without them. If SeaWorld cut that out, they still have a ton of other things to offer, from rides and other shows and other animal exhibits. They don't necessarily need to die on this hill. But they chose to die on that hill. And, I mean, can you blame them? I mean, the killer whale is in their logo. It's their mascot. I mean, they've built their entire brand around the killer whale. If they get rid of that and, give in to this without putting up a fight, well, they're basically kind of signing their own death certificate. But ultimately, what they didn't realize is that by fighting this fight, they actually only expedited their death instead of holding it off. You see, in the years following Blackfish, SeaWorld would see a significant drop-off in attendance across all their parks year after year after year. And it's not hard to see why this happened. You have to keep in mind, who was SeaWorld's target audience at this time? You gotta remember, at this time, SeaWorld had maybe a couple of rides at each park, and for most part, the focus was on the animals. It was on the shows. It was on the aquariums. So by having this perception around them that they don't care about marine life, when they previously were seen as the saints of the marine life community, constantly rescuing hundreds of animals every year and, treating their animals well and stuff like that and educating people about marine life, that's how they were seen before Blackfish. After Blackfish, they flipped a switch and all of a sudden now they are the villains of that community. And now all these people who love marine life hate SeaWorld. And those are the people who would come to SeaWorld the most, spend the most money, and ultimately make up a large part of their attendance. And though the CEO would proudly hop onto every earnings call and say, oh, no, this has nothing to do with Blackfish. It was bad weather this year, guys, just bad weather. That's why people didn't show up. It was clear that Blackfish had tarnished the brand image of SeaWorld. And you think I'm just making assumptions here? The CEO of SeaWorld was literally fined $5 million years later for lying about Blackfish impacting the attendance of the SeaWorld parks. So there you go, folks. And it would take 3 years for SeaWorld to give into the pressure and finally make a change based on what was said in Blackfish. That decision being to end the breeding of killer whales at SeaWorld, meaning that the killer whales that currently are living at SeaWorld will be the last generation, and once they die, killer whales will be gone from SeaWorld forever. And flashing forward to today really quick, I could tell you SeaWorld was not bluffing about this. They went from 29 orcas in captivity at the time they announced this in 2016 to 18 as of 2024. And though certainly a step in the right direction, it doesn't immediately solve the problem, meaning that for a lot of people, this change ultimately didn't mean a whole lot. And even though SeaWorld continues to make changes to try and make their animals' lives better, the bottom line is perception is reality. And people still see those shows going on, they think nothing's changed. And a great example of this is a comment on the Blackfish documentary here on YouTube. This is, no joke, the top comment on the documentary. And it says that SeaWorld has not changed anything. And listen, you can certainly disagree with the actions that SeaWorld has taken to try and rectify the mistakes they've made, but to say they've done nothing, it's proof that SeaWorld has not done a good job of promoting the changes they've made. And because of SeaWorld's lackluster initial response and then eventual late response to actually take action, they're still seen as the big bad wolf in the marine life community. But this is where things take a shocking turn. SeaWorld is on their deathbed. They're about to take their last breath, and they throw up a Hail Mary shot to save the company. And that is to shift the focus of the parks away from marine life and aquatic animal shows to rides, changing the perception of the parks from wildlife parks that happen to have rides to amusement parks that happen to have aquariums on top of that. And this brought a whole new audience to SeaWorld that previously was not in their target demographics. And in the late 2010s, they actually began to see a bounce back in attendance and revenue for the first time in years. And it seemed like SeaWorld was finally coming back. COVID happened and all the parks shut down. They had to furlough 90% of their employees. And all of a sudden, just when it seemed like SeaWorld was finally getting themselves back on track, they finally were finding their footing once again. They once again found themselves on their deathbed, clinging to life. And COVID put a lot of companies out of business. SeaWorld was stumbling going into the pandemic, going into their parks having to shut down, and them having to take on enormous amounts of debt. It kind of seems like this is the beginning of the end for SeaWorld. So why don't we flash forward 2 years and see what the damage is? This can't be right. This can't be right. Really? Record total revenue? Record net income? record adjusted EBITDA, record total revenue per capita.
What the scallop?
Yes, folks, you are reading this correctly. 2 years after COVID, after the parks had to shut down for months, SeaWorld comes back with their best year ever. Underline that, highlight it, put it in your notebooks. Ever for the company. Best year of all time. Unbelievable. I mean, who could have saw this coming?
Me! Hello!
Yes, 4 years ago, I made a video saying that SeaWorld was going to have a great decade ahead of them in the 2020s. This was actually shortly after COVID started, so wow, that was really ballsy of me to say. But yeah, I was right, and I need to bring it up because quite a few people felt the need to comment, "This video didn't age very well, did it?" Well, guess what, buddy? Your comment didn't age well. Anyways, you see, despite the shutdowns, SeaWorld did not slow up in their investments in the parks. They were confident that they were going to come back and that their strategy that they had been working on in the late 2010s would continue to work as they moved their parks more into amusement parks instead of wildlife parks. And indeed, once their parks did reopen, people came to them in droves. Of course, 2022, the whole theme park industry was seeing booming success, with the exception of Six Flags, who was being idiots over there. But beside them, everyone else was having a roaring comeback. But most companies were not seeing their best years ever, right? I mean, you think about Disney and Universal, they were still a far cry away from their attendance numbers in 2019. Where SeaWorld, yes, they weren't at record attendance yet either, but they weren't that far off. And they were hitting record numbers everywhere else. It seemed that SeaWorld had finally cracked the code to finding success once again in the amusement park industry. But it wasn't just SeaWorld spending money to make money here. It was also them dramatically increasing prices and taking advantage of the pent-up demand for amusement parks and in-person experiences that people have been deprived of for the past 2 years. I mean, even in comparison to Walt Disney World, the most expensive place on earth, SeaWorld was outclassing them when it came to prices in the park. Now, obviously, admission into SeaWorld is much, much lower than it is into Disney, but if you were going to buy anything in SeaWorld, SeaWorld was going to take an arm and a leg from you. But it wasn't just the price increases, it was also SeaWorld instituting this little puppy, a 5% surcharge on every single purchase. And this was not necessarily made super clear. It was obviously kept in very small text on signs, and most people didn't even realize that they were getting charged until after they saw their receipt. But SeaWorld was basically adding 5% to every single purchase in the park for really no reason. They just did it because they did it. Instead of raising their prices by 5%, which of course they knew they couldn't do because they already were raising their prices an exorbitant amount in order to get even more money from people, well, they just had to tack on 5% to everything and kind of, put it in the little corner. So it's like, okay, well, we did show it to you, so you can't sue us, can't say we lied about it, but it's there and you paid it. So thank you. But regardless of this unethical practice, SeaWorld had completed the comeback story. I mean, they were beaten down, they were bruised, they were on their deathbed not once, twice in the past decade, and now somehow are putting up the best numbers they've ever had in their entire existence. Just unfathomable stuff here, folks. But there you have it, folks, the fairy tale ending for SeaWorld. They're finally riding off in the sunset with future success. Oh, this is the 2023 numbers. Decreases year over year across the board, with the exception of total revenue per capita, which is basically how much money each guest is spending, which of course is up to a record high as SeaWorld continues to raise their prices.
You blew it!
It seems that SeaWorld has kind of lost their value status as a theme park. People no longer perceive them as being that much of a discount from Universal or Disney, even though their admission price is way lower since people went in 2022 and know that the prices in the park are insane. A lot of people don't even bother going there anymore. Though SeaWorld had those record high numbers in 2022, they were still below their 2019 levels as far as attendance goes. And now, because they saw a decrease in 2023, they're even further back from that number. Now 3 million guests behind where they were in 2019. And you really kind of wonder, I mean, if they couldn't get back to that level in 2022, and unlike their competitors, unlike Disney Universal, who are continuing to climb higher and higher, getting back to those 2019 levels, they're now heading in the opposite direction. You do kind of wonder, are they ever going to be able to get back to that 2019 attendance level? I mean, we mentioned it earlier, the marine life enthusiasts still hate them. And now, everyone who visited your park in 2022 has a negative perception of you as well because you jacked the prices up like crazy on them. And let's take a look at the income statement here, folks, because despite the fact that revenue per capita was up, the amount that SeaWorld made from admissions year over year was actually lower than it was in 2022. Combine this with increased operating expenses, despite the fact there were less people in the parks in 2023 versus 2022, and the fact that they, for some reason, spent over 10% more on marketing? Like, huh? Usually when you spend that much more on marketing, the expectation is that you're going to bring in a whole lot more guests. And that just didn't happen. Instead, you lost attendance. Clearly, SeaWorld needs to rethink what they're doing in the marketing department because whatever the hell they were doing there is not working. And also consider this, folks. You know, I just kind of brushed over it saying it was a decrease. They dropped almost 20% in net income year over year from that record high they had in 2022. Almost 20% down. I mean, that is a brutal drop. But does it just end there? Take a look at their balance sheet. Sure, their cash increased substantially year over year, but their debt barely changed. I mean, you remember how I said they took on so much debt from COVID? They're still saddled with it, over $2 billion worth. And take a look again at the income statement. Interest expense went up almost 25% year over year. SeaWorld is kicking the can down the road on their debt, and it's costing them substantially as far as how much they're paying in interest every year. The one promising sign for SeaWorld, though, is that they did substantially increase their capital expenditures, aka how much they're spending in the parks each year. They're fully committed to this strategy of continuing to invest in new rides and attractions for the parks to make them more full-day experiences where you don't even necessarily have to do any aquarium or wildlife-related things, and you can just enjoy rides solely at these parks. But regardless of that, it's undeniable, 2023 was an awful year for SeaWorld. I mean, just a complete step in the absolute wrong direction, especially after where it seemed like they finally figured it out in 2022. For them to just completely miss the mark in 2023, you know, it's not looking great for the company in its future outlook. However, the company has made some changes and some commitments that have actually spiked the stock price and have really satisfied the stock market. One of those is they're going to do a relatively major stock buyback, which would basically increase the value of every share left on the market, which is great for shareholders, not so great for the actual parks themselves, because that money could have been getting put towards actually, improving the parks instead of just buying shares. And perhaps the most consequential change, the fact that this company is no longer called SeaWorld, is now called United Parks and Resorts. Perhaps the least offensive, most generic name you could possibly imagine. In spite of all the changes SeaWorld has made over the years, and the moves they've made to re-identify themselves, ultimately, for many people, that SeaWorld name is always going to be perceived in a negative light. So SeaWorld is just throwing it in the towel, and they're saying, all right, we're not SeaWorld anymore, we're United Parks. And now, obviously, they're not changing the names of any of their actual SeaWorld parks. So SeaWorld Orlando, SeaWorld San Antonio, SeaWorld San Diego, they're all going to remain named SeaWorld for now. But it's clearly a sign that they're moving away from that branding, as it's taken such a beating over the last decade that it really does seem unredeemable at this point. And honestly, given all the changes SeaWorld has made over the years, it isn't even a bad idea to change the name, because really you're not even the same park or the same company anymore after all the changes that you've either been forced to make or have willingly made yourself. But let's be honest, folks, changing your corporate holdings name is not going to change the hearts and minds of the general public. It's just not. So really, after a disappointing 2023, the future of the company is once again in jeopardy and in question. And I have to say, 2024, SeaWorld's 60th anniversary, by the way, none of the SeaWorld parks are seeing any major investment opening up this year, right? It's mainly small family coasters that are the big investments for this year, so I don't expect any major attendance increase this year. And then you talk about 2025, 2026, there might actually be a slight pop thanks to Epic Universe opening up in Orlando. That's going to bring a lot of new guests to Central Florida that will really benefit SeaWorld Orlando and Busch Gardens Tampa. So maybe SeaWorld will do decently well in those years, but after the hype of Epic Universe wears off, once again, you really have to wonder, where does SeaWorld go from here? Can they regain the guests that they burned through their marine life actions? Can they regain the guests that they lost because of their price hikes? That's all going to remain to be seen. And I don't know what the future of SeaWorld really holds. And perhaps the moment that we just saw in 2023 with all those decreases across the board, perhaps that is the beginning of the end for SeaWorld. So anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think that SeaWorld is headed towards its final resting place? Or do you think that it's actually going to continue its comeback story and rise up the ranks? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Love to hear what you have to say. And I'll see you all next time. Peace.